Greetings. Thank you for joining us for today's EarthEcho STEMExplore Virtual Career Connection featuring Dr. Krista Sherman, Senior Scientist with the Perry Institute for Marine Science. My name is Casey. I'm a Programs Manager with EarthEcho International. And we are joined today by one of our exceptional Youth Leadership Council members, Olivia, and she's going to moderate today's live event. Here at EarthEcho International, we're proud to work with an outstanding group of young leaders who help drive our work and to empower their peers around the globe to take an active role in protecting our planet. Olivia is an integrative biology PhD student at the University of South Florida, where she is both a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Fellow and a University of South Florida Presidential Fellow. Olivia currently studies jellyfish and loves to go to the beach, and she loves to dance in her spare time. So take it away, Olivia.
Thanks, Casey. We are so excited to have students from all over the globe joining us as we learn about exciting and sustainable careers in science, technology, and engineering and math. This live event is part of STEMExplore, EarthEcho's program that brings inspiration to life by telling the stories of dynamic female professionals in STEM careers during live virtual career connections. We want to thank our founding sponsor, United Technologies, for their support of women in STEM. Here at EarthEcho, we believe that youth have the power to change the planet. Visit earthecho.org to learn more about our programs. You can also access resources like STEMExplore's career profile videos, as well as tune in for upcoming live events, just like this one. I'd like to recognize and thank STEMExplore's partner sites across the country and recognize those that are joining us today. So first off, let's head to West Palm, Florida and get a hello from FAU Pine Jog Environmental Center. Hello, Pine Jog. Awesome. Now let's head to Cedar Rapids, Iowa to say hello to our partners at Jefferson High School. Greetings, Jefferson. Now let's head back down south to Coleman Park with primetime Palm Beach County in Florida. Hi, Coleman Park.
Hello.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Now let's head across town in West Palm Beach to our partners at Berkshire Elementary. Greetings, Berkshire. And lastly, hello to our friends at Green Acres and Green Acres, Florida. Hello, everyone. We also want to welcome all that have joined us on our live streams. Just a reminder that you can send in questions for our STEM expert via chat, and we will break throughout today's presentation to see if you have any questions. Feel free to start typing questions in the chat space on YouTube or in the Zoom feed. We'll be sure to answer those as we go along. Now let's get started. I want to welcome our special guest for EarthEcho STEMExplore Virtual Career Connection, Dr. Krista Sherman. Hello, Dr. Sherman.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me.
Krista graduated with her PhD from the University of Exeter in July 2018. Since then, she has returned to the Bahamas and taken on a full-time position with the Perry Institute for Marine Science as Senior Scientist with responsibilities for developing and implementing the Fisheries Research and Conservation Program. Krista has extensive marine animal husbandry and research experience, evaluating the status of Nassau grouper and its spawning aggregations, including the use of underwater visual surveys, population genetics, and acoustic telemetry to understand patterns of connectivity, assessing impacts of invasive lionfish on native species and ecosystems, monitoring the health of coral reefs, mangrove, and seagrass habitats, coral restoration, and conducting rapid ecological assessments for proposed marine protected areas, or MPAs. Krista also actively contributed to several national research projects, for example, the GEF FSP, building a sustainable national MPA network in the Bahamas, the Bahamas leg of Living Oceans Foundation Global Reef Expedition, mitigating the threats of invasive alien species in the insular Caribbean projects, Bahamas Protected, and coral restoration and monitoring under the Atlantis Blue Project. So Dr. Sherman, why don't you tell us more about yourself and your career?
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. So excited to see all of you. Well, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, I can't see it. Can I see it again? There we go. So as Olivia mentioned, I work for the Perry Institute for Marine Science. And as you can see, where is that pin located? It's not New York. Well, I give you a hint. It starts with V.
Oh, Vermont.
Right. But I don't live in Vermont. Next slide. So I live in a country that's located on the map in that pin. And Casey gave you a hint a little bit earlier. Does anyone want to take a guess where that may be? I'll give you another hint. It begins with B. Yeah. Awesome. So I am from the Bahamas, and if you go to the next slide, Casey, the official name is the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and we're pretty spread out. So we are an archipelago of islands. It's more than 700 islands and over 2,000 keys, and we're spread out in the Atlantic there, sort of between Florida and Cuba. And I live on the island called New Providence, where the capital, Nassau, is located. So even though we're a relatively small country, when you consider the amount of people that live there, we're pretty spread out. So it's over 100,000 square miles of ocean. So this is where I was born. This is where I grew up. And like many of you, I had lots of hobbies. Some of them I've kept over the years. So I spent lots of time swimming. I learned how to snorkel when I was a kid, and I still snorkel. That's still a hobby of mine. I was really into music, so I learned how to play the piano. I was really actively involved in singing and choirs individually. I did karate for a time. And in high school, I also was a member of the debate team. So debating was a really important part of what I did growing up. And I really tried to get involved as much as possible in any programs that were marine oriented or related, because that's what I was most passionate about. So I volunteered a lot and did a lot of internships that were unpaid during that time. And if we go to the next slide, I left the Bahamas after I finished high school, after taking a bit of a break, and I did a bachelor's degree. And when I came back to the Bahamas, my first sort of job in the marine related field was at Atlantis as an aquarist. So as an aquarist, you're responsible for animal husbandry. You interact with the guests, often talking about the species that you work with. In this particular image here, we're working with a vet that came down to do an ultrasound on a sawfish that we suspected may be pregnant or carrying sawfish pups. So that was really interesting for a time, and I learned some new skills, but I really wanted to be more involved in research that had an applied conservation focus, and I wanted to develop those skills. So if we move on to the next slide. I left and I pursued a master's degree. And when I came back home, I worked for 2 years at the Cape Eleuthera Institute and the Island School. While I was there initially, I worked a lot with Dr. Ed Brooks with the shark program, looking at the abundance and distribution of sharks in Eleuthera, which is another island in the Bahamas. So that's the picture on the bottom right. At that time, I got to use some of the information from my master's research and started a lionfish program, did a lot of work with patch reefs there, mentored some students that were part of the Bahamas Environmental Stewart Scholars Program. And so that's primarily what I focused on there, but I left that position and moved back to New Providence, which is the island that I'm from and the island I'm on right now, and then took a full-time position with the Bahamas National Trust. So I continued doing lionfish work then, and those of you, some of you may have heard of lionfish before. It's an invasive species, so that's why I was doing that work, to understand the potential impacts it was having on the marine environment. So continued with that work. Got involved with work to help make the Bahamas a shark sanctuary. So that's a picture that you saw in the previous slide that said Bahamas sharks now protected. That's me with the poofy hair at the top there and the shark swimming around. So that was pretty exciting. We also got to work on a number of projects related to corals. So if you flip to the next slide, Some of this work was funded through the Atlantis Blue Project Foundation. And back then we were starting a lot of work on coral nurseries and coral restoration. So trying to understand things that may inhibit or impact coral growth during that period where we fragmented those corals and are hoping for them to grow. So what I'm doing in this image is actually painting some snails with nail polish. This particular type of snails feeds on this type of coral, which is elkhorn coral. And we treated these rims with material to see if they were effective at trying to prevent some of these snails from climbing over and starting to prey on some of the corals, because what you want is to have healthy fragmented corals back on the reef. So those are some of the projects that I was involved with at the time. During that period, I also got really involved in AGRA assessments, and it's a protocol that we use to assess the condition of reefs. But one of the things that kind of changed the direction of my career for the next several years and led me to do my PhD work was doing work on this particular fish. Has anyone seen this fish before? Yeah? What do you think it is? Any guesses?
Coleman Park, what do you think it is?
Okay, it is a grouper, so that's very good. Good body shape and recognition, but it's not a Goliath grouper. It's one of the it's smaller than the Goliath grouper. Any other guesses?
Let's go to Pine Jog and see if they have a guess for you.
Is it a catfish? He just said it was a grouper. Oh. I think it's a catfish because of the It looks like I'm sorry, but it looks like
All right, Dr. Sherman, why don't you go ahead and tell us what it is?
What it is. It is called a Nassau grouper. Okay, and it's one of the largest predatory groupers that we have on our reefs, but it is critically endangered, and that means it's facing extremely high risk of going extinct. And I started studying this species in 2010, particularly these areas that we refer to as spawning aggregations. And simply what that means is an area where these fish go to breed, but it only happens at specific periods of time for a discrete period of time. So in the Bahamas, that happens around the full moon, and it happens during the winter months when the water temperature is a little bit cooler. But what happens is, fishermen have learned when these spawning aggregations are occurring, and so it's pretty easy to overexploit these fish, and so they become critically endangered. So that kind of started the work. And if we go to the next slide, I'm just gonna share a video of some of what we've been doing to monitor these spawning aggregations and protect this species.
And stand by for 1 second here. Let me go ahead and bring that video back up.
Okay.
The sound was not working, so I'm going to try this again. And if you could just talk a little bit more while I try and troubleshoot this, maybe go ahead and just kind of prime everybody for what we're going to see. That'd be great.
Okay. So as I mentioned, this Nassau grouper, they breed during the winter, and what we were doing and have been doing since 2010 is trying to find these sites where this breeding is happening and getting numbers on the amount of fish that are there, recording any fishing effort that's happening. And for the Bahamas, we have a closed season for Nassau grouper, which means it's off limit to fishing during part of the period when the species is breeding. So this video kind of shows a little bit of a highlight of some of the work that we did for one of these trips, and that was off of, it was a location between the Lake Zuma and Long Island in the Bahamas, in the central Bahamas. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit of that so you can see what it looks like.
All right, hang on one second. I'm still working on it. It's not cooperating with me.
But it's just a friend of mine told me, and I kind of like this. She's like, it's pretty hard when you're tasty and trying to breed and lots of people want to eat you. So that's kind of what the deal is with this fish.
So while Casey's still pulling that up, I'm going to ask a quick question, if you don't mind. So I know you mentioned that this fish is pretty tasty. Is that still a popular fish that is sold either in the Bahamas or throughout the Caribbean or even in other countries?
Yes, so the demand still exists for this fish, and that's one of the reasons it is facing the declines that it is. So not just in the Bahamas, but in other parts of the Caribbean where the species is found, it's been heavily fished. There are some countries that have taken some drastic measures to try and counteract that and have had complete bans on harvesting or fishing for the species at all. And that's helped to start to speed up the recovery process. But here in the Bahamas, we have minimum size limits. We have the closed season. So those are the measures that we currently have for Nassau grouper.
All right, let's see if we have this video back.
Well, I'm actually from the Bahamas. I was born here, grew up here. I've been in the water since I could remember myself. It's just really natural to me. I feel really at home in the water. It's a way to do something that I'm passionate about and to help try and advance that forward. So it's sort of applied conservation research.
Yeah, Nassau grouper are of particular interest here in the Bahamas. They're the most important finfish fishery species, the most valuable to fishermen. And they're also considered to be endangered by the World Conservation Union. The Bahamas and a couple other countries are some of the few places where a viable population still exists. Throughout their range, where they used to live throughout the Caribbean, they've been fished out in most places. In addition to myself on this trip, we have a couple representatives from the Bahamas National Trust, a representative from the Bahamas Reef Environmental Education Foundation. We have a teacher with us. We have a representative from the Ocean Crest Alliance here in Long Island. And we're going to have some fishermen from Long Island out with us on this trip. So really we have a diverse crew, everyone with an interest in conserving the species and really trying to protect it for future generations of Bahamians, but all coming at it from different angles, from the conservation world, from the science world, and from the education world as well. We don't have good numbers on how many Nassau grouper there are in the Bahamas. What we do know is that each year the Nassau grouper migrate to spawning aggregations to spawn. We're seeing a few hundred fish at a spawning site versus 10 to 20 years ago when it was common to see thousands at similar sites in a similar area. The other thing we're finding in our research now is that even though there's been a closed season in place for about 10 years now, there's still a high level of poaching that goes on. We do see evidence of active fishing at nearly every spawning site that we go to. It's only really about a half-hour window that we have to actually catch the fish when they're spawning. Individual fish make spawning rushes and release their eggs in about a second or two. So we really need to be in the right place at the right time following the fish, because once they spawn, that's it for the year. What we see with Nassau grouper is that they spawn during the full moon in either December, January, or February each year, with individual fish migrating to spawning aggregations up to a couple hundred miles to get from their home range to a spawning site. And it takes 5 to as many as 9 years or so for them to go from the time they're born to the time they're ready to start making spawning aggregations.
Well, it's really important for us to have involvement from a number of different sectors. With the fishermen, they're the ones that are, I guess, most in contact with the resource on a regular basis, because that's their livelihood for a lot of people. You know, it's sometimes hard for us. It's one of the things that we struggle with is, you know, we're always thinking about things in terms of the science, in terms of applied conservation, but also trying to explain things in a way so that people understand that there are benefits even outside of just the marine environment. So the long-term benefits mean if we are able to protect the fishery now, that we can continue to have those fish to, you know, harvest in the future. We just want to promote sustainable fishing practices. We're not trying to take away the fishery resource from the fishermen. That, you know, I can continue eating grouper, they can continue eating grouper, their kids and grandkids can know what that tastes like and continue to eat and enjoy grouper. Yesterday was kind of interesting because we had fishing boats out here.
Yeah, so if you want to watch more of the video in the last little bit, you can. It's on YouTube, and I can share those links with you, or Casey can as well. But that kind of gives you a sense for what I got into in 2010 and some of the work that I've continued to do during that time. And as you would have heard during that short presentation, one of the reasons that we're so interested in Nassau grouper is they're really important to the health of the coral reefs, but they're also a hugely important resource to the Bahamas, to the fishermen that depend on it, to people that depend on it for food. And so we want to make sure that we can preserve them, but their life history, their reproductive strategy makes them extremely vulnerable during that period. So that's one of the things that I'm really focused on and will continue to work on. So if we go to the next slide, basically what I decided to do for my PhD was to address these issues. So there are a number of research priorities that were identified for Nassau grouper, and my PhD research really focused on these. So continuing to try and understand and monitor these spawning aggregations, figure out where they were, when they were occurring, how many fish are there. So continuing to be in the water doing these underwater visual surveys, but we're actually also started collecting subsamples of these fish and doing some more in-depth work. So that included tagging, as you see in that photo on the left, those fish. So we inserted external tags that we can use to identify individuals, collected blood samples from some of these fish, measurements, so their length and weight, also collected fin clip samples for genetic research to understand how healthy these populations were, how diverse they were, how connected they were, and using internal tags or transmitters that pair with devices that we call receivers that are deployed on the ocean floor. And so if a fish swims within like 150 to 200 meters of that receiver, it records that information, and we can use that to track their movement patterns or their swimming or migration from the home reefs to the spawning site. So basically we used a very interdisciplinary approach to try and understand what's happening here and use that information to develop recommendations for conserving the species and managing a little bit better in the Bahamas. And so basically from 2014 to 2018, that's what I did. I spent a lot of time at my computer, as you can imagine, analyzing data, writing reports, got the opportunity to learn completely new skills because I had no background in genetics before this or any lab experience. So that was all very new to me, and it was a steep learning curve, but I'm glad that I did that. Also had an opportunity to interact with scientists from all around the world with different backgrounds, and that's been extremely useful because you can develop new partnerships and projects with people that have slightly different backgrounds and research specialisms, but they can be complementary to what you're doing, and then sharing that information, not just with the scientific community, but with the general public. So that's primarily what I've been doing or did for my PhD, and I continue to do some of that work now as well. So I don't know if you want to, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love how you touched on how interdisciplinary so much of the science and the work that you're doing and how it required so many different skills. So I think so often we think that, you know, science is just based on what happens in the lab, but so much of it also comes with writing skills and being able to communicate your research. So I think that was a really, I love how you touched on all the different aspects of your work that sometimes don't always get highlighted in the sciences or in the STEM
And one
fields.
of the postdocs that was in our lab that helped to teach me, Andy King, said, you know, one of the things that people don't think about is you kind of also have to be a bit of a historian as well, because you have to kind of go back through time, see what's been done, try and make sense of the data of your findings and help to use that to put that in context of what you're seeing now. So it's really really such a broad field, and you do use all kinds of skills, some of which you would not even think about, but they are used.
Absolutely. So now let's check back in with our interactive sites to see if they have any questions for our expert today. So first, let's head to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Jefferson High School, what questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
All right. You guys are good to go. What questions do we have? What was it? What major did you take mostly?
Okay, I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but that's a good question. So for my first degree, I did a bachelor's in marine science. I can walk you through the other ones now if you want. Yeah? Okay, so I did a bachelor's of marine science. I did a master's of research in ocean science, and then I did a PhD in biological science.
What other questions do you have? Oh, yes, over there.
What's like your day-to-day life for your work? Like what do you
What's
do?
my day-to-day life like?
Yeah, for your work.
Okay. Mostly if I'm not in the fields, and I'm usually in the fields at least once a month or once every 2 months, and that can last from a week to 2 weeks. Day to day, I am at my computer, actually. I do a whole lot of writing and answering emails, writing abstracts, writing papers, analyzing data for reports. Often we get called upon to provide guidance, so answering questions from people that work in different government ministries, attending workshops, but most of what I do on a day-to-day basis, if I'm not in the field, is writing.
Extinctions of the fish, is that a demand from the people, or is that just like a global issue that's going on? Pollution, like stuff.
Did you pick up that question?
So was the question, are those fish, is that a local issue or a global issue?
Yes.
That's
so
a
the
great
conservation, question. That's a great question. So the conservation for Nassau grouper globally is critically endangered. So this is not just a local issue. The Bahamas is fairly fortunate in that we still have in some areas viable or really good or relatively healthy populations of Nassau grouper. So densities of this fish on reefs tend to be higher than what you see in the Caribbean. The challenge is that a lot of these spawning sites, or the areas where they breed, those numbers are not as large as they used to be. So in some instances, we know that some of our spawning sites that used to be active and used to support up to 100,000 grouper, for example, no longer form. There are no more fish there. So that's a problem. And so this is a challenge for us. We do have sites where, you know, they're still supporting relatively large numbers of Nassau grouper, but generally there's been a decline. And the numbers of fish at spawning aggregations, we're also starting to see a declining trend in terms of densities on reefs, even though if you compare them to other areas, we're doing better. But this is something that's concerned, and why globally they're listed as critically endangered.
Those are all great questions. Next up, we're going to head to FAU Pine Jog in West Palm Beach, Florida. What questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
Can't hear you. Sorry. What other fish have you worked with?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I primarily work with NASA grouper during the breeding season and then when I was doing some genetic work, but I work with all kinds of fish. So basically anything that is native, and in some cases like the lionfish that's not native to the Bahamas, I study on the reef. So groupers, snappers, grunts, jacks, sharks, which aren't fish, but rays, all kinds of things.
How much do you get paid?
That is an interesting question. So marine scientists, depending on where you work, the level of experience and qualifications, the range in salary starts at about 25,000 and that goes up from there. But it depends on whether or not you work for a for-profit or non-profit organization as well. So between 25 and 80,000 on average is what you would find for people that work in this field.
Is this your forever job?
Yes, this is my forever job. This was my dream job when I was little. I didn't know exactly what I was going to be doing, but I knew I wanted to be doing research, and I'm doing that now. So yeah, this is my forever job.
So those are all great questions, and we'll have a little bit more time at the end to ask a few more questions. But for now, we're going to move on to our next partner site in Coleman Park, West Palm Beach, Florida. Coleman Park, what questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
How do they keep the tracking device on the fish, and how does it hurt? Does it hurt them?
No. So there are two types that we put in. There's that Floy tag, that just gets inserted right behind on the side of the dorsal fin and stays there. The other tag is we have to do surgery, put the fish to sleep. I know this seems really weird, but just like when you go to the doctor, if you ever need surgery, you get put to sleep, and then you insert the transmitter right there, and then you suture it or sew it back up, let the fish recover, and when they have recovered and completely conscious, regained their equilibrium or their balance, then we escort them back down to the reef where we collected them from. And the sutures dissolve over time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ask the question.
Do we have another question at Coleman Park? Coleman Park, do we have one more question? And then we're going to move over to Green Acres.
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, we don't have any more questions.
Okay.
Okay, so last but not least, we're going to move over to Green Acres in Green Acres, Florida. What questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
At the moment, we don't have any questions. Some other people asked the questions that they were thinking of.
Okay, great. So everybody has such great questions. So now we're going to move on. Can Dr. Sherman tell us a little more about your educational path and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So that was one of the questions. So I took a break after undergrad because I was feeling a bit like I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do for my master's. I wanted to get some experience. So I took breaks basically between every single degree. So I took a break after high school, took a break after my bachelor's, took a break after my master's. But essentially I did my undergraduate in Florida. And that was at Jacksonville University. I think you have another slide, Olivia. Yep, so in Florida, there at Jacksonville University, and then I came back home, and then if you go to the next slide, then I crossed the pond and went over to the UK for my master's. So there are different types of master's programs, and some of you may have heard about taught masters or MSCs. I did a master's of research, so that was a little bit different in that it's 80% research and only 20% taught versus the other way around for the MSc. So I did that at the University of Southampton at the National Oceanography Center, and that work was focused on lionfish, trying to explore the potential use of habitats and diet. And then if you go to the next slide, lastly, I went to the University of Exeter and I graduated from there last year. So I handed in my thesis in February, defended in May, and then graduation was in July. But as you can see, I spent a whole lot of money on education, tuition, and that's excluding living expenses. So it's really expensive. And I neglected to mention this earlier, but I grew up in a single parent family. My parents divorced when I was about 8, and my mother very much insisted that we stay in school. And so it was, sacrifice on her part, but I appreciate her support. So like many of you may have, I had student loans. I tried crowdfunding to help as well. I had partial scholarships for both my undergraduate and for my PhD, but my PhD was self-funded. So that added another layer of stress, but also a really good motivation to finish on time. Yeah.
And Dr. Sherman, can you tell us a little bit more about your current work with the Perry Institute for Marine Science?
Sure. So currently I work for the Perry Institute for Marine Science. So after I graduated last year, I love traveling as well and dancing like you, Olivia. So I took some time off and bounced around Europe for a little bit. And then I came back home and started working for the Perry Institute of Marine Science in November. And PIMS is a nonprofit research organization, and we're really dedicated to working on healthy oceans and ecosystems and promoting biodiversity and sustainable use of marine resources and marine habitats. We're a really small organization, a few staff. 4 of them were just hired this month, and that's all of our staff that you saw in the previous slides. They're a really small organization. And if you go to the next slide, you can visit more, learn more about our research if you visit our website at perryinstitute.org. We also have both Instagram and Facebook social media accounts where we post regular updates, but essentially our work is focused on key marine fishery species, climate change, coral reefs, and marine protected areas. But as you would have heard earlier on today, my focus is the Fisheries Research and Conservation Program. So that's a program that I'm developing and leading for PIMS. And I really work with both local and international scientists and a range of stakeholders and conservation partners in country to help promote healthy fisheries, sustainable fisheries, work on fisheries governance, but everything's science-based. And I'm really, really passionate about helping to build capacity in country for Bahamians that want to get more involved with research. So building that technical capacity to help with promoting fisheries policy and governance that is science grounded. So basically, that's a lot of what I do. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the field. I recently returned from Abaco in Grand Bahama. I was in the field for 2 weeks. So outside of NASA grouper work and work that I do in the spawning season, a lot of what I do is assessing the condition of marine habitats, a lot of coral reef related work, but I also work in mangroves and in seagrasses as well.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like you get the best of both worlds of getting to be in the lab and also getting to be in the field quite a bit. So I'm definitely very jealous.
Well, now that I'm not in England anymore, I don't really do any lab work, but the field bit is the bit that I love. It's the bit that keeps me sane and keeps me going.
Right, right. So Dr. Sherman, here at EarthEcho, we believe that we can act now for a sustainable future. Can you tell us, how does your job contribute to a sustainable future?
So as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we do is science grounded, but it's all applied conservation focused. So recently, for example, I was involved in an expedition. A lot of you may have heard about Hurricane Durian that hit the Bahamas in September. And that was a very, very strong hurricane, category 5. It was awful. It impacted a lot of the communities in Abaco and Grand Bahama, and we went out to assess the impacts to reefs. So, you know, this research isn't just research to write a report or write a paper, but we can use some of the information that we do to provide recommendations to help with improving habitats, help with restoration, help with coastal development and planning, help with marine protected areas, and as I mentioned before, fisheries governance. So, that's a huge focus for the work that I'm involved in.
That's amazing. And it's always really, I feel for me anyway, very rewarding when you see your science actually being able to be applied to the communities that you're working in. So it sounds like you have a very big influence in those communities, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, we try to, and we have a new program that's coming on board that hopefully will help to expand that even further now that we have a social scientist on board. So really well-rounded approach to marine protection and policy and outreach and getting the communities involved to affect sort of behavior change for the work that we're doing.
That's amazing. So now we're going to go through one more round of questions for our expert. So first off, we're going to start with Green Acres in Green Acres, Florida. What questions do you guys have for Dr. Sherman?
They said that they didn't have any questions again.
Okay, so that's no problem. Now we're going to move on to our next site, and that is going to be Jefferson High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. What questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
All right, what questions do we have?
How does it like when I say globally, like how does it impact the food chain globally?
So how does the fish population impact the food chain? Like globally, you said? Did you get that question?
No, sorry, can you repeat that for me?
That's okay. How does the fish population impact the food chain globally?
The food chain globally? I'm not sure I quite understand your question, but healthy reefs usually have a certain number of predators, certain number of grazers, fish that have other functions. They may be omnivores. So, in order for a reef ecosystem to be healthy, you need to have healthy proportions of all those fish. And if you have a lot of your predators removed, that's going to create knock-on effects in your food chain. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question or if I understood your question.
Oh, how does it impact us, like these fish?
Well, so yeah. So obviously everyone doesn't eat fish, but this is an important livelihood for some people. So economically, this is food security, but these fish are also important to reef health. And coral reefs have benefits to us outside of just the aesthetics. So they offer shoreline protection, for example, so helping to be that first line of defense against hurricanes. People are also exploring the use of harvesting different materials and organisms from reefs for their pharmaceutical properties or for cancer-related treatments. So there are all these benefits that healthy reefs provide us. And so it's important that we have healthy and resilient fish populations and all the components that make up a healthy reef ecosystem to not only have biodiverse and healthy ecosystems, but to make sure that they can continue providing those ecosystem services that we need to survive.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great questions. So now we're going to move on to Coleman Park Primetime in West Palm Beach, Florida. What questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
So she stated that she went to the Bahamas after Hurricane Durian. I wanted to know how did Hurricane Durian affect the ecosystem in the Bahamas based off, like there was like a lot of, trash and flooding and, it messes up ecosystems. So I just wanted to know how did that affect the Bahamas ecosystem?
Okay, so I actually was here during the hurricane, so I'm from here. I was actually here when that happened, but I wasn't on the islands that were most heavily impacted. There was flooding, major flooding in Grand Bahama and in Abaco. There was a lot of infrastructure damage in both areas, especially around Marsh Harbor, Abaco, the east side of Grand Bahama. In terms of the ecosystem impacts, like to the reef itself, what we saw during assessments, there were some reefs that experienced minimal damage and other reefs where we did see more damage. The reefs where we saw more damage, for example, we would see signs of debris that were land-based. So if you go to our website, you can see some of these images or on a Facebook page. But for example, we saw lawnmowers, pieces of air conditioning, reefs that were broken and fragmented and toppled over. So those are all of some of the types of damage, in addition to a lot of sedimentation or silt covering the reefs, trash, trees. Those are some of the things that we saw that created damage to the reefs.
Wow. Does Coleman Park have any more questions for today?
No. How many NASA groupers are there still now?
That's a very hard question to answer, and that's something that we're working on. We won't be able to ever give you an exact number. We can give you a range, but we're working on doing a stock assessment for the country to figure that out. And what we're trying to do is go to all the sites where fishermen or other people have reported that there are spawning aggregations to try and get abundance estimates, and then we'll have a better answer for that question. So stay tuned. But I can tell you that globally they have declined significantly compared to what they were historically. So that's well over 70% population decline.
Well, I look forward to seeing what your latest results are, because I know that is definitely a very pressing issue for a lot of the Caribbean countries. So now we're going to move on to, last but not least, FAU Pine Jog and West Palm Beach, Florida. What questions do you have for Dr. Sherman?
Go ahead.
I think this might sound same to what's your favorite job?
What's my favorite job?
What do you, is this your forever job, but do you like your job really much, or do you feel like quitting?
No, I like my job. The diving, for those of you that may get around to it, is a very expensive hobby, and luckily for me, I get to do that as part of work and don't have to pay to go to a lot of these places. So that's one huge bonus. But I like that I'm doing something that will hopefully make a difference one day.
Great, thank you. Go ahead for the next question.
Do you deal with other animals at your job?
Yeah, I deal with other animals, and not just animals, with like mangroves and seagrasses as well. So some of the habitats that animals like conch, rays live in.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
One of them, how did you find this job?
How did I find my job? Well, I guess my job kind of found me, to answer that question. So the organization that I work for right now, that I've been working with the executive director of this organization for a number of years, starting with the NASA grouper work, but also with the work that I did in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park on marine protected areas. So we've known each other for a while, and he was interested in developing more fisheries related program. And given my background, it was a likely kind of fit. And what's your other question?
My other question is that, do you like working with other kinds of fish?
Do I like
working with other kinds of fish?
Yeah, I like working with other kinds of fish. I really do. I like learning more about them. I like looking at fish still, makes me happy. Yeah.
Is there any other departments you would like to work in except for the one you are in now?
No, I really like research, so I think I'm going to stick with this.
Go for it.
If this wasn't your job, what would your job be?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I think if I didn't get into marine science, it would have been something completely opposite. So I would have been doing something music related.
Go for it.
How long do you work for?
Like, what are your hours?
What are my working hours? Well, that depends. So if I am on a research trip, I have really odd working hours because I get up really early to start work. And I usually go to bed really late because we need to also enter data at the end of the evening. So it's really long hours. So usually from about 6 or 7 to 11 or 12 at night. So it's really long hours. When I'm not in the field, I try not to work the same hours. That doesn't always happen. But yeah, usually, about 9 to 6 or 7 most days.
Well, great questions, everyone. Dr. Sherman, do you have any words of advice for students tuning in?
Yeah, there are so many more opportunities that are available to you right now. So I would advise you to take advantage of those opportunities and don't take them for granted. If you have the good fortune of being invited on a research trip or doing internships, do that and do it well. If you're passionate about something, pursue that. If you have skills in a certain area, really develop those skills. But and if you're going to do something, try and do it well and commit to it. That's not to say that you won't make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, but try and learn from them and grow and really try and practice good work ethic and good work habits that will see you through the rest of your career.
That is great advice. Well, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and a big thank you to Dr. Krista Sherman for joining us today. You can keep in touch with Dr. Sherman on social media, as well as check out the great work that Perry Institute for Marine Science is doing by visiting their website. I'd also like to thank the STEMExplore partner sites and classrooms that have tuned in live today, especially our interactive sites. Great questions, everyone. EarthEcho has some exciting opportunities coming up. STEMExplore will continue tonight as we feature women in STEM careers with our virtual career connections. We have several live events scheduled this month and on into December. Again, visit earthecho.org to see our entire lineup and to register. Be sure to stay connected with EarthEcho on our social media channels and on our website. Thank you again to our wonderful STEMExplore mentors, Dr. Krista Sherman, and thank you to United Technologies for their tremendous support of our programming. On behalf of EarthEcho International, thank you for joining us and keep exploring.
Thank you. Bye, guys.